Did they evaluate what happened to the spiders when they tried to drive a little spider car? No, they
Isn't a
didn't.
spider
Or
car
their
an actual car?
depression, or what
Yes.
happened to their depressive symptoms, too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Welcome once again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone who is confused by the latest health study, as I am by air travel. What a mess. Did you guys fly over the holidays anywhere? Was it horrible?
No, but we were lucky. We were flying back from the Dominican Republic to Boston, and,
Yeah.
and there were no flight delays because the snow was, kind of all west of us.
Yeah.
But it was very, very, very windy, and it was a kind of a terrifying white knuckle flight.
Ooh.
Where the plane is kind of like leaping around. You're like, wow, I hope those wings don't fall off. That kind of bouncy.
Wings falling off is definitely bad.
I don't know.
Jess,
we didn't
what
go
about you?
anywhere, but the worst is when the luggage starts to come out from the bins. That's really scary, and you feel like the end is near. Right.
Okay, can I ask you all a question that I have had in a discussion with some friends that I shouldn't be admitting on air
4chan?
that I don't understand? But I want to understand this. Every time I'm in a plane, I look at they now, like, you have the flight information that tells you you're flying this fast and this altitude. And then they tell you the temperature. And the temperature, even if you're flying in the middle of the summer, because you're so high, it's like minus 43 degrees.
Right.
Why don't clouds freeze? Clouds should freeze.
I think that they are. I think that they are crystals at that height.
But why isn't it a giant sheet of ice? Like, I imagine the pilots are flying and they've got to go really fast when they get to the clouds to break through that sheet of ice.
This is a really good question.
Every time
why
they're
are they
like,
not solid?
"Ooh, we just made it through."
Well, it's like snow. It's like very, 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 very fine snow.
You think?
I think so. Because
Okay.
otherwise, according to your theory, we would hit those sheets of ice and it would be dire.
You don't come out of the clouds and like the wings are coated with little crystals of ice.
Do you think it has to do with something having to do with gravity? Like, ice requires the particles to be really close together because it becomes like a solid mass. But if things are kind of, maybe they're not condensing. I don't know.
All I can tell you is I've looked it up and I haven't been able to find a good explanation. So
I feel like you've asked this question before on this podcast.
I have because it's something that deeply concerns me.
Doesn't any of us have some younger children who are doing earth sciences who could be tormented with
I'm
this
sure
kind of
they do.
question?
Yeah, no, I have asked this before and I've not gotten an answer. That's why I bring it up again. Okay. So I am Matt Fox from the Departments of Epidemiology and Global Health at the BU School of Public Health. I am joined once again by Dr. Jessica Liebler from the Department of Environmental Health at the BU School of Public Health. Welcome back, Jess.
Thanks, Matt.
And we have returning guest and host, Dr. Chris Gill. He's
Returning
back from
champion.
sabbatical,
Hi.
returning champion. How are you doing, Chris?
It's so nice to be here. I as you may all know, I've been on sabbatical this year in the Netherlands at the University of Utrecht Medical Center.
And I'm just curious, were you on sabbatical? Were you on sabbatical? Folks
I was
can't
just
see
going
I'm
to say,
doing air
what were you
quotes.
doing there?
I was having a wonderful time there is the answer. I mean, what a great country, first of all, and such an interesting group of people I was working with. I had a lovely time and am, of course, glad to be back with my family. I miss them all terribly. But if you go away for a year, you're going to like fall in love with the place you were at. And it was very sad leaving. And I left a lot of friends behind. And, it was hard to go in the end. It was hard to go.
I'm sure. Well, we're glad to have you back. And as a reminder, everyone head over to the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthex.org. That's BU's hub for lifelong learning. And also head on over to iTunes or Stitcher or your favorite podcast app and give us a rating. It helps us win all of the podcasting awards that we're going to win this year.
But we no longer talk about our Twitter handles because we don't do Twitter at BU anymore.
Well, that is not totally true. So explain for the audience.
The big picture, of course, Elon Musk going absolutely bonkers in the public space. And, Twitter sort of devolving into this horrible cesspool of media conspiracies and right-wing propaganda more than it ever was. And over the break, our dean, who has been a very avid Twitter user, to put it clearly and succinctly said enough is enough and we want no more of that. And so he stopped, he said he sent out an email to us all saying no more Twitter from me. And, and I was like, I immediately followed through because I haven't tweeted anything in over years, in many, many years. So it was an easy break for me to cancel my Twitter account.
It was a very easy break for me because, as you know, I could never even remember my Twitter
so
password.
we are not prohibited from tweeting.
No.
Our school has made the decision they are coming off of Twitter. I don't know if that's permanent or if that's just waiting to see what's going to happen. But yeah, I think it was a big move. So
can I ask a question though? It seems like a lot of people are retweeting, and that's considered not participating. I've noticed that a lot, where you might not be tweeting original tweets, but there's a lot of people who are off Twitter who are now retweeting things that they put out last year or
on Twitter
on their same account. But there's, instead of tweeting original tweets, they're just retweeting things, and that's viewed as being
kind of lame.
Better. I don't know.
I don't. Well, look, there is no. Again,
you're a Twitter guy.
There's no requirement that anyone get off of Twitter, right? That was just a decision that the school made for the school accounts. So people can do what they want.
Because it's evil and destroying civilization.
So if people want to continue, they can, or if they feel like they're rather just going to step back and retweet, that's a decision everyone has to make.
So instead, we've all embraced the metaverse. Is that what's happening next?
No, that is not what's happening.
Okay. All right. Mastodon, Truth Social, where are we going? I mean, what are we supposed to do?
We're just going to call each other on the phone.
What?
Social.
What's a phone?
I mean, I still have my LinkedIn account, but I'm sorry, LinkedIn, but it is the most boring social media
I do notice
on the planet.
I do notice you keep your MySpace page up to date as you dial in through your MindSpring account.
Oh my God.
Anyway, on to the show. So today in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we are going to look at a study on magic mushrooms and depression. Okay, that's not exactly what it is.
That's kind of
what it is.
Kind of accurate.
And in the second part of the podcast, our deep dive, we're going to talk about the health literacy. What do you want to call it? Problems with health literacy? The health literacy gap?
I can't even spell literacy.
Okay, well, I don't know what to do with that. And then in our final segment, which is our Amazing Amusing, we'll get into some things that make us laugh out loud or we just found interesting. So let's jump in. Segment 1. So the article was published in the New England Journal of Medicine entitled Single Dose Psilocybin for a Treatment-Resistant Episode of Major Depression. Did I pronounce that right? Because I noticed you pronounced it differently.
Psilocybin. I have no idea.
I've always heard. I thought it was psilocybin. But anyway, Nick, what's the ruling? Psilocybin.
A third permutation, in fact.
I was just thinking it rhymes with Regis Philbin, so it's kind of like every time I look at that, I think of Regis Philbin. Psilocybin is what I was thinking.
Oh.
Okay,
is that when psychiatrists don't communicate with each other very much?
Right.
Clearly, we don't have a lot of experience with this. It was by first author G.M. Goodwin of Compass Pathfinder, which I think we could talk about what that is when we get to it. But a few headlines. This was going to grab some...
Guy Goodwin.
Oh, sorry. You're right. So some headlines. So Yahoo says magic mushroom compound shows promise as a depression treatment in key study. MSN says study finds what just one dose of a synthetic magic mushroom can do for hard to treat depression. Science Daily promising results from psilocybin trial for treatment-resistant depression. And Business Insider, the compound in magic mushrooms that makes you hallucinate eased people's depression in a trial. Here are 4 risks of taking psilocybin. So they added on their own take on this. Okay, so Chris, you're gonna give us the skinny on this study?
Yeah, no, really fascinating article, and a great article to come back to. The first podcast since my reentry. I was also very glad to see that the New England Journal of Medicine still exists. That they hadn't gone bankrupt in my absence. I was wondering if they might.
Why?
Just wondering, because I wasn't reading them.
Because you weren't here.
I wasn't there to read them, so I thought maybe the readership, kind of collapsed.
That's actually a fair point.
Anyway, let's sort of put this into a bigger context here, which is that, and we talked about this a lot over the history of this podcast, that, depression is a huge problem, enormous source of lost productivity and some loss of life and of quality of life, that affects the entire planet. And so major depression is a majorly unmet public health need still. And despite the fact that we have many, medications to treat depression, the truth is, and we've talked about this in the podcast, these drugs tend not to work particularly well. And when they do work, they take a very long time to work. And so they're, the treatments are far from excellent, shall we say. And more generally, I think depression depression is a very complicated problem to solve, partly because we don't really know what causes it. And the more we study it, the more it appears that it might be many different things, and which probably makes mechanistically it rather challenging to sort of hone in on, what is causing depression in your patient, and the fact that we don't really have good animal models for how to study it like we do with other diseases. And then there's no real experimental model that can be used like in a petri dish, to sort of see does this antibiotic kill these bacteria. You can't really do that with neurons in a human when we're talking about this complicated functional behavioral mechanism. And so it's a very, very, very difficult problem for the pharmaceutical industry to solve. And, going back 20, 30 years, there has been this prevailing theory called the chemical imbalance hypothesis to sort of describe why people have depression. And I think we've now kind of moved away from that as being really overly simplistic, and this was basically that, the lack of serotonin in your neural synapses is what makes you depressed, and which was the justification for selective serotonin uptake inhibitors like Prozac or Paxil or many other drugs. And the problem is that, even if it is true that these drugs change the serotonin concentrations, that doesn't seem to change your depression, at least not for 6 to 8 weeks. And so the theory seems a little bit full of holes right away. And then there have been some really provocative studies where they use drugs to kind of chemically deplete people's serotonin artificially, and it did not induce depression. So there's another kind of blow to the theory, but to my mind, the thing that is most hard to reconcile with this is the fact that antidepressants take months to work. And so if this is a chemical imbalance, why wouldn't it take hours to work? All right. And now we have sort of like stumbled into this new age where it actually appears that there are treatments that can work almost immediately on treating depressive symptoms. And one of these is electroconvulsive therapy, which has, of course, been around forever and has all sorts of adverse connotations associated with it. And yet it remains that people who've been electroshocked tend to come out of that experience with an immediate resolution of their depressive symptoms. And similarly, transcranial magnetic stimulation has had profound and short-term results. And more recently, the use of psychedelic drugs, particularly psilocybin, and we talked about MDMA a couple episodes ago, and others have actually experimented with LSD. And in all of these cases, we've seen that these have profound and short-term immediate effects on depressive symptoms. And so it's all a long-winded way of saying that clearly we have not understood how depression works, because now we're seeing how it can be modified in ways that completely conflict with the old dogma that has guided psychotherapy development for the last 50, 60 years. Mm-hmm. So here we are. And so in this study, the research team was this organization you mentioned called Compass Pathfinder, and I'd never heard of them and was really curious.
Me too. Yeah.
Who are these guys, right? Usually when you read one of these kinds of clinical trials in the New England Journal, it's like Pfizer, and so you know who it is. And it's like Compass Pathfinder, who the heck is that? Turns out it is a multinational advocacy / foundation with deep pockets that was established to promote the use of psychedelics as a treatment for mental health disorders, and particularly psilocybin, or psilocybin, whatever we call it, the mushroom compound.
The mushroom compound.
And they were the ones who sponsored this trial. And the lead author of this paper, this guy you mentioned, Guy Goodwin, is a British psychologist, not psychiatrist, but a very distinguished academic who's been around for ever. Trained at Oxford, worked at the MRC in Edinburgh, and he recently joined the Compass Pathfinder organization as their chief scientific officer, and was the one who designed this trial. And so we should know that Compass Pathfinder is not a pharmaceutical company. They are not marketing a product, but they are promoting the use of products. But in this case, they actually did supply the drugs, the active compounds that they needed to run this clinical trial. So contrary to the media thing that you'd mentioned before, they did not actually take mushrooms. What they did was they took a pharmaceutical preparation of concentrated, purified, standardized psilocybin at different dosages.
Yep.
Now, what they did in this trial was to address the particularly severe problem of people with treatment-resistant or recurrent depression, major depression. These are individuals who have had multiple episodes of depression over their years, or who have been treated, for many long periods of time with antidepressants and just simply have not been able to get better. And so to do this study, they enrolled a large group of individuals, 18 years and above, who had major treatment-resistant depression or recurrent depression, who were screened, across 22 countries. There's really a huge amount of work that went into this. To enroll all these individuals with treatment-resistant depression, they, categorized them as having depression using a screening tool, and then later ranked their depression using this thing called the MADRS scale. And I wrote down what the
Matters.
It means the MADRS, the Montgomery Asperger Depression Rating Scale. And I assume Asperger is the same guy for whom we named Asperger syndrome. Who knows? That would be Asperger, I guess. So maybe not. At any rate, and they all had to have a certain score on this. And then they were randomized in 3 groups to either receive 25 milligrams of psilocybin concentrate, 10 milligrams of this, or 1 milligram of this. All of these individuals went through a lengthy sort of roll-in process where they were evaluated by trained psychotherapists who could have been psychiatrists or psychologists or nurse practitioners, but they all had to have a standardized training, and they crucially were all blinded to which treatments their clients were receiving. They were all on antidepressants initially, but prior to the actual experiment, which is a single dose of one of these 3 different doses, they were tapered off of their antidepressants over a several-week period, and then were ranked on the MADRS scale the day before they started, and then went in and had a therapeutic session and received one of these 3 doses blinded. This, in fact, was a so-called quadruple blind study, which was new to me, but means that the patient was blind, the therapist was blind, the researchers were blinded, and the people who evaluated the impact of the response to these 3 different doses were also blinded. So everybody was blinded. I thought it was quite a nice little rigorous response.
Yep.
And their primary endpoint was, did they have a significant decline in MADRS score depressive symptoms? What they defined a response as being a 50% decline in whatever their baseline score had been before they took the drug at 3 weeks after receiving the drug. But they also followed them out for 3 months to see, how sustained these effects were. And the effects were really pretty impressive, I thought. I don't know how you guys reacted to this, but I was like, wow, not bad, in fact. So I wrote this down in a little summary table. Of those who got 25 milligrams, 37% of them had a 50% drop in their symptoms. Of those who got the 10 milligrams, it was 19%, and the 1 milligrams, it was 18%. So we're effectively looking at the difference between the 10 and the 25 milligrams as being effective, with the 1 milligram being a sort of a homeopathic dose that was basically the control. Of those who had a complete remission, which means that their score fell below 10 points on this 0 to 60 point rating scale, the responses were also 19% in the 25 milligram group, 9% in the 10 milligram and 5% in the 1 milligram. And then if they follow them to 12 weeks out, i.e. 3 months, the sustained responses were respectively 20%, 5%, and 10%, and the latter 2 did not differ statistically. There were, of course, more adverse events in the people who got the psilocybin than those who received the control. The results were somewhat predictable in terms of adverse events. A lot of them had headaches as they were coming off the psilocybin, which is not surprising. It's sort of basically the hangover effect of taking a drug like psilocybin. Maybe more concerningly, there were some serious adverse events in terms of suicidal ideation events that occurred in 2 patients who had received the 25 milligram dose and one who had a self-injury event. So the 3 out of these 79 or so who had received that dose had this effect. However, it should be noted that all 3 of these individuals previously had episodes of suicidal ideation and or self-harm, and were all amongst the group who had not responded to the psilocybin. And so these were effectively treatment failures. And so, I think that's something to pay attention to, but overall, that to me felt less concerning. And overall, I was rather impressed with this and thinking like, this is a rather powerful proof of a maybe new paradigm for treatment of major psychiatric disorders. I had a lot of questions coming out of this, as I'm sure you all did, but that was sort of that's the basic summary of what they did in this study.
Great. 2 things I just want to emphasize before I turn it over to you, Jess, which is number 1, this was what phase trial was this? This was a phase 2 trial. Yeah. Can you explain that for what a phase 2 trial is?
Yeah, sure. So in clinical development, you tend to go through these different sort of sizes and foci of research. So in phase 1, you are generally, if you're talking about a drug, you're generally merely interested in trying to understand the tolerability and like obvious side effect profile of the drug. And so what individuals would do would be they would be enrolled. These are usually healthy volunteers who may or may not even have the condition that the drug is for. Sometimes they do. I think in cancer trials they usually do. In other drugs they often do not. And I don't know if there was a phase 1 trial of psilocybin. I think there probably was, but I didn't go through the literature behind in their bibliography. And so that would be like a dozen or so participants, and they would generally be given escalating doses to see what happens as you increase the dose. And at what point they start to say, oh, I don't feel so good. And then you would sort of say, okay, that's the maximum tolerated dose. We're done. And at the same time, they would do all sorts of lab tests to make sure you're not having end-organ toxicity and the like. But very rarely in phase 1 are you actually trying to understand, does the drug treat anything useful? You're just trying to understand the pharmacokinetics, really. In phase 2, you now sort of move towards much larger trials where your interest is shifting from safety and pharmacokinetics to more clinical efficacy. Does it in fact work? But usually you're doing this at a relatively small scale while still focusing on safety events. And
dose.
And dose, yes. Often in phase 2, you may continue to look at dose.
Yeah.
Frequently, in fact, that would be the case. And then when you coming out of phase 2, appear to have shown that the drug is working or seems to be working, and you have some general sense as to what the effect size might be, and that you have a pretty good sense of what the safety profile appears to be, companies would make a decision, shall we proceed and attempt to license and market this drug, in which case you would go to very large clinical trials, which typically cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, run for, across thousands of patients, sometimes, in vaccine trials, 50,000 patients would not be unusual. And there the focus is really now on confirming efficacy and safety with a relatively high degree of precision as a step to licensing the drug.
Yeah. And I wanted you to go through that just to emphasize, this is a phase 2 trial. So this was 80 roughly participants per arm.
Pretty small.
And I would argue largely focused on dose. And because there was no placebo arm or you would never have a placebo arm, but let's say a comparison to continuing antidepressants, and then preliminary efficacy, but this wouldn't be a confirmatory, this wouldn't be the large studies. So that's just worth noting. The second thing I wanted to point out is this was not a study of taking mushrooms, right? This was a study of very controlled amount of psilocybin, along with meeting with a therapist, tapering off of antidepressants in a controlled environment with special glasses and music and integration sessions after. So it's worth emphasizing, this is not a study of just, should you go out and, stop your antidepressants and take mushrooms instead, right? This is a very different thing. So Jess, given that, what was your take on this study?
This was an interesting one. I was glad that we did a deeper dive into this one in particular, because I'm not sure this is one I would have picked up otherwise. I had a few thoughts on this study. I think, first of all, overall, this COMPASS group, one of the things I thought that was really interesting up front is that all of the functions that I think we as professors typically fill or our colleagues typically fill were filled by outside consultants. So they had an outside medical writer, they had an outside statistician, they had outsider folks. And so that was an interesting thing to read through all those different functions. You're like, when I write, I do all those things. Or like we do, we have teams to do all those things. So that was something right off the bat that led me to the structure of this paper, which was somewhat different than other research that I've, been more familiar with. I had a few comments. One thing that didn't jump out to me immediately was the meaning of the difference in the MADRS score. And so it looks as if they found their result that they said was important. It's this difference between it's statistically significant, but is it actually meaningful in the context of depression? Mm-hmm. I think they found a 6-point
drop.
It
was a delta of deltas, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I was left saying, okay, this is a statistically significant difference, but what does it mean for someone who is experiencing treatment-resistant depression? Is this a meaningful change in what does this mean for them? Does this mean you go off antidepressants? Does this mean that you're feeling great? Or is this like a mild change in some of the symptoms? So kind of the meaning aspect was not as explored to me as someone who's not familiar with maybe the psychiatry literature or the psychology literature. And then I also doubted that the participant was truly blind
Definitely
to
not.
their dosage status. Yeah.
So this would be a study where you don't have it because you don't have again, what we're calling a placebo, but would be some other active treatment.
They definitely knew they were hallucinating.
You would definitely know you're hallucinating. So that, but even in this case where there isn't one, you might even know the dose, but I'm not, so the question is, does the dose really matter to the way you respond? And I would argue, maybe, because if you know you're hallucinating, you might report, and given the outcome is something that is somewhat subjective, you might report your symptoms differently, knowing you just went on a big trip and you think this is going to help you. So it is possible.
Right. Or
it's
like
possible.
an interest, or for people who've had many medication failures to treat this really intractable disease, there might be a strong kind of psychological motivation to like want this to work.
I think that's right.
And there was some evidence that this is not a sustained effect. That could be because the effect is real and isn't sustained because it's a short-term benefit, or it could be that there's just differences in the way you report things when you've immediately come off of a really hallucinogenic experience and might feel differently about the way you're reporting things than you might report it, a week later even. So, some evidence of that.
Yeah. Well, I had a whole series of questions where I felt like, what didn't we learn here? Mm-hmm. And what I think we did learn is that 25 milligrams is more effective than 10 or 1. But what we didn't learn is 25 milligrams, is that as effective as 50? Like, why 25? Like, is in fact 25 milligrams the optimal dose, or could you go higher? Question number one. The question number two is they only gave a single dose of this and observed the impact over the next 3 months. And so, like, what if people were to take this once a week treatment?
I don't know.
What if this was part of like an integrated, regular therapeutic session involving, counseling with a therapist, but this happened repeatedly? Would you get better results from that than a single dose? So I think, there's a lot of potential for where would one go next on this.
I think I agree with that. And I think one of the interesting questions in reading this is kind of what is the counterfactual? So they had all these people taper off their antidepressants. And then they had the psilocybin, and then it looked like some of them in different trajectories went back on antidepressants during the 3-month study period. But then they statistically used an approach where they kind of hypothesized what the reduction in the increase in the MADRS score, the worsening of the depression, which I think it goes up. I think the score goes up as you are more depressed.
Yep.
So they kind of hypothesized what the increase in the MADRS score would look like in someone who remained unmedicated for the 3-month study period in an attempt to kind of model the counterfactual almost. And I wasn't sure that I totally got it. Like, I think, the idea that, yes, I could see if you were looking at a continued exposure, and then you could say, okay, we're looking at this sustained response to a continuous exposure over a given period of time. I was unclear with the kind of tapering off their pre-existing meds, giving them one dose of something, and then some of them going back on meds, others of them not going back on meds, and then they were kind of statistically modeling what they expected the depression to look like in an unmedicated. It was a little confusing to me. Yeah,
I was a little unpersuaded by that. To be honest,
how much of that is due to the fact that there is no placebo arm here, and so you're sort of modeling what you think is going to happen compared to what actually happened. I want to amend something that I said. I said there were not sustained benefits, and it's technically a true statement. But if you look at their figures, I mean, there were sustained benefits in the sense that people were better than they had been over time. It's just that they bounced back towards in the direction of where they had been, but they still stayed better than they were in the beginning. But that was true of every dose. So hard to say what that means.
The listeners can't see the very thrilling figure 2.
Thrilling.
Here.
I mean, I was just thrilled to read it.
Titled Changes from Baseline in MADRS Total Score. And basically, this is a track of their MADRS scores over time from the beginning of the trial through the end of the trial. And what you see is for the 3 different dose arms, that the deepest drop in the MADRS score, which goes from 0 to around -16 at 2 days after the treatment, compared with the 10 milligrams who go to -12 and the 1 milligram who go to a -9, they all drop, but the 25 milligrams drops the deepest and the 10 milligram the second deepest, and then they kind of drift back upwards. But by the end of 12 weeks, they're still not back to where they had been.
None of the groups.
None of them are, right. They're still about 6 points. Well, in the case of the 25 milligrams, they're about 10, 11 points-ish lower than they had been at the beginning. And for the 1 milligram and the 10 milligram dose, they're about 6 or 7 points lower than they had been from the beginning. And so at 12 weeks, the highest dose was about 6 points better off than the other two doses had been.
Yeah.
And so there you wonder, like, you see this big dip and then a gradual rise. What if they repeated it 1 month? Would they see an even deeper dip?
Yeah.
Would it continue to dip? Or, do you see, the effect all at a single exposure and that's it? Given my understanding of pharmacology, that seems unlikely. I would imagine it's much more likely that it would work better if you did it repeatedly. But we got to see those studies. That's next.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, Chris, but what do you make of the fact that, so when they talk about there was no benefit, the highest dose was better than the lowest dose, the middle dose wasn't, statistically speaking, and you can obviously see that there. But the fact that all three groups showed benefit that was sustained, like if it was just benefit, period, then I would say that could just all be placebo effect and it all rises back to where it was. But it doesn't. Every group, even the 1 milligram dose. The 1 milligram dose, they're substantially, well, I don't know substantially, but how to know what it means. But a 6-point drop sustained 12 weeks later seems,
And drop is good. Drop is good. Right?
That seems meaningful, and you don't get any kind of assessment of that because there's no placebo to compare it to.
Right.
And again, I don't emphasize, it wouldn't be a placebo. It would be standard of care.
It is kind of like a placebo trial because the 1 milligram dose is presumably so low, though who knows what 1 milligram of
I was going to
psilocybin
say, I don't know anything. I don't know what
we don't know from personal experience.
We need
but
an expert consultant
to
on
come
this
in
one.
and
Nick?
One of my friends from college, maybe.
No, apparently Nick doesn't know.
But it did bring up the question of if the lowest dose had the smallest adverse effects profile, maybe that could be something that could be dosed more frequently. We were talking
Good
about,
point.
With maybe more sustained, if modest, benefits.
Yeah, there's so many interesting, what would you do next with this?
Right.
Like if you had the money, where would you go?
If you were the compass.
Isn't this always a problem? I mean, anything you can think of, like the COVID vaccines, like we don't know that the dose and the number of doses and the intervals between them is the ideal way you would have dosed but you've got to try something, and you try a few things that seem reasonable, and then you sort of make a decision. You could go back later. In COVID, right? It was sort of an emergency. We had to make a decision. Done. Boom. But in lots of things like this, antidepressants, things like this, you could find something that you find effective, and then you could spend a lot of time later figuring out what's we could refine it and make it better. But it seems to me like these are not unreasonable. Well, I can't say they're not unreasonable choices, but I mean to pick only 3 choices seems to be a reasonable place to start.
Yeah, if we assume that the 1 milligram dose was truly too low to have any pharmacological effect, that kind of gives us an interesting way of measuring the placebo effect here.
If that were true, we just don't know that that's true.
But let's assume that it is true, because then it tells us that there's a placebo effect associated with all 3 of these doses, right? But on top of that, you get the actual pharmacological effect, which is dose dependent, that the 10 and the 25 milligrams do better, but they all experience that massive immediate impact, which may not be totally placebo. I think is probably a lot of it is actual neuropharmacology going on, and the effect of psilocybin, which probably makes you feel like great and changes all these neural pathways and does a bunch of stuff that we truly do not understand. But something happened there, and then you kind of drift back up to what we're going to say is the true mean residual effect, and then tracking that forward is really fascinating.
Yep, absolutely. Let me ask you another question. This is a highly controlled substance in the U.S., and I'm going to assume in most of the countries where this was done, right?
Yes, it is illegal, but not.
Unless you're in Colorado.
In the Netherlands, you are not allowed to sell mushrooms, but you can sell psilocybin extract that has been put into gummy bears.
Only gummy bears?
Well,
that should be in a bear shape.
So if it's not in the bear shape,
gummy
doesn't count.
worms, not included.
Which I don't know, does it mean that they're trying to standardize it? I don't know exactly what the legislative intent or the policy goals were there.
Yep.
True. If there's like a pharmacological unit of the gummy bear,
right?
Like
exactly.
a vitamin unit for children.
I mean, if you're feeling very hungry and you eat, combine them with marijuana and then eat 10 of those, I could think it could go very badly. And California is now flirting with the idea of.
Well, didn't Colorado?
Or was it Colorado?
And they did. They did. Well, so my understanding, I could be wrong about this, so apologies if I get it wrong. They decriminalized it. I don't think they legalized it.
Okay.
I could be wrong about that, but meaning I think they're not going to prosecute people, but it isn't technically legal. I could be wrong about that, though. I may have misunderstood the law.
Well,
but hang on. But the reason I'm asking this is this was done in lots of different countries. I lost the list, but there was
Right.
it was
I wrote them down.
It was throughout Europe and
how
the
many
US
countries?
and Canada.
It was 10 countries.
I would have thought, given it's a highly controlled substance, the regulatory burden, the hassle of actually being able to allowed to do the research would be high, and therefore you'd want to limit the number of countries. So that would suggest to me, you only got 225 odd patients here, or 230.
Yeah.
Were people hard to find, or do they want a lot of geographic diversity? I mean, I was curious about that.
It is puzzling. Czechoslovakia, the United Kingdom, Denmark. Well, I handwriting several, but I think I wrote Germany, Ireland, Netherlands, Portugal, Spain,
Atlantis.
the U.S., and Canada, and Atlantis. Yes.
Yeah.
The lost continent. They found it.
All right. Any last comments anyone wants to make about this? I mean, the other thing I would say is, it is worth noting the adverse events were high,
are worrisome.
and not surprising that you'd see a lot of adverse events, because adverse events do include things like headaches and nausea, but some of them were severe. But there was one that I did want to ask about, and I wondered if you all had any insight. Did you read the list of adverse events?
No, I missed that. Tell me, what did you spot?
I did. It's in
table
that-
3.
it's
The
in
one
that
that kind of
table.
stood out to me was euphoric mood. That doesn't sound like an
As being adverse.
Adverse
Is that
event.
adverse?
That sounds like a
I kind of like
Yeah.
like
the
a
idea,
plus.
but I wondered if that had some technical meaning that was
feelings
different
of
from
extreme happiness.
Yeah,
Well, I guess
like annoyingly happy.
Annoying. Just being annoying.
I don't know. That one just stood
Yeah.
out to me as a surprise.
It was it was interesting in looking at their serious adverse events, and then they were making the case that this was a population where their serious events happen frequently,
exactly.
and they're happening evenly across their 3 exposure groups. But it, so kind of it's interesting to think about the adverse effects needing to be contextualized in the circumstance of the outcome that you're looking at.
Yep. All right. Any last thoughts? Can we move
just
on?
Looking forward to seeing what's next.
Yeah.
With euphoric mood? Do you have euphoric mood right now?
I would be happy to have a euphoric mood once or twice in my life.
Yeah, fair enough. I wouldn't seem like an
I feel like
adverse event to me.
I'm in a euphoria-free zone these days. So,
Okay, let's move on to segment 2. So we were going to talk about health literacy. There was a paper in the Lancet that sort of sparked this, called "Why Is Health Literacy Failing So Many?" They talked about the fact that globally health literacy is just something that we don't have.
it's pretty bad.
Probably have never been very good at, but certainly, in the wake of the pandemic, mis and disinformation has been rampant, and therefore the information that people need to be able to make good decisions, information about tobacco, alcohol, junk food, things like that has been changing. And I admit, I think
Are you implying that it is not possible to find high quality information of that sort on Twitter?
I'm not arguing that it's not possible. I'm saying it's deluged with
Completely misleading nonsense.
disinformation. So this is sort of talking about a WHO report on health literacy, calling for, more formal approaches to health literacy, recasting health literacy as a collective practice of a community, so something we should all be committed to and engaged in. And it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me this sort of butts heads with our Western sensibilities of, everyone should get to decide for themselves and, stuff like that. We've demonstrated over the course of the pandemic, we're not very good at collective action, and we seem to believe in freedom over decisions that would probably be best for the common good. So I'm just curious where you think health literacy fits in, given that we know that health literacy would only be one of the pieces necessary for actual improvements in healthy behavior. Just knowing that certain things are good or bad for you is not enough for people to change their behavior. But even then, people can't always change their behavior. If you don't have money for healthy food choices, or it's just unpalatable or unpleasant to you, you're not going to make those changes, even though you know that it's good for you or bad for you, depending on what it is. So thoughts on health literacy? Do we need, should schools be training kids in health literacy, or did you get any training in health literacy when you were in school? We had a health class.
We had a health class in middle school. I remember it was a lot of giggling because it was about the reproductive system largely, right?
Yep,
right.
Yep.
But I think what was, the contribution of this article and reflecting on this WHO report was the idea that, we think of health literacy traditionally as passing information on to people so they have information and can make decisions, and tend to neglect the social or family constructs in which people actually, in reality, make health decisions. And so in neglecting those social factors, the literacy often goes nowhere, and then we wonder why. And then we wonder why. And this happens not just in, we think about health literacy, it happens in high-income countries and low-income countries, the idea that decisions are made in context. And I thought that was, it was an interesting thing to think about. And I think you're right that in the context of the pandemic, not like a shock, right? To hear this information. I mean, I think when I think about health literacy, even just in my own family, for example, my parents, I think about my parents who are older people who have access to a tremendous amount of information, but still feel very intimidated by the medical complex.
Yeah.
And we'll go to a doctor's, we'll know all kinds of stuff. Like my mother will have all kinds of things about her, her health needs and her questions. And she'll have 8 minutes with a doctor and will feel very stressed. And then I will ask her, what did she say about all these things? And she'll say, I didn't ask her. I got really anxious and I didn't ask her. And she was really rushed. And that's like kind of our structure that we often live in, where there's this hierarchy between patients and the medical system, where patients might know a lot of things or might have a lot of questions, but are not able to get the information they need. And so that was what I was reflecting on, just in my own personal, experience in thinking about literacy in our country or in our, in our kind of in my environment right now. And, that the information intersects with the construct in which someone needs to get access or needs to get information or needs to get health care.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think we also live in an era where there's too much information. Mm-hmm. So you become, paralyzed by the amount of information. So we have to write a syllabus for our students, for our classes, and those syllabi have been getting longer and longer and longer as we've been asked to put in more and more information for students. And the end result is, I think fewer students actually read the syllabus than they used to. Not that it was ever a common thing for students to read syllabus. I can say as an undergrad in the 90s, I did not always read the syllabus completely, but they're so long now that I would never think of reading the whole thing. And so then all of those pieces of information that are probably critical get lost too. It's the same thing with health literacy, I think. There is so much information out there. You can access anything you want, but how do you know which is the right, especially when you can get conflicting information on everything. So we need reliable sources, but we also need concise, clear communication.
Yeah. Well, I am so jaded and cynical at this point and frustrated, and I don't know what the answer is.
At this point? You've always been this way.
I sort of, when we started the podcast years ago, I was sort of hoping that this would reduce my cynicism, but it has actually done the opposite. Because I think a lot of the things I see, like in the New York Times, there's a very popular health column by Tara Parker Pope. I don't know if you read this. I read it. I read it all the time, and I confess that most of the time it kind of annoys me because
you read it anyway.
I read it anyway, and I think it's sort of part wearing a hair shirt, but I they all have the same arc. Like some question will be posed. I can't think of one off the top of my head. Like does asparagus cause flatulence? I don't know. Or does this thing lead to this health outcome, good or bad? And it's usually something where, let's be honest, the medical literature is completely ambiguous and does not offer an answer. Yep. And so, the arc of the story will usually go through, there's this study that says there is a risk and this other study that says there isn't a risk, and causation is not correlation, so we don't know. And so then they go to the expert who's some, doctor who studies this thing, who also doesn't know because the papers are the same papers and they don't provide an answer. And so then they ask the doctor or expert's opinion, and the opinion is usually based on their personal bias.
Yep.
And then so I'm like, okay, so we've gone from question to no answer to here's my opinion. And is the opinion right? Who knows?
Yep.
Right. And that's the story.
That's where
and
we
then
are.
The next paper, the next article by Tara Parker Pope is exactly the same thing. Another unanswered question leading to a completely ambiguous ending. Right. And yet usually counts because almost all always it comes out with some advice. Like, even though we have no idea what we're talking about, we're going to advise you to do X. I'm like, wait a minute. How can you simultaneously say you don't know and then start to give advice about what to do about it? That's the part that actually gets me the seeing a little bit red when I read these articles.
Yeah, I think you read those differently, though, than the average person would read those, in the sense that I don't think the average person reads that, gets to the section where the doctor gives the opinion and looks at that as, well, that's just one person's biased opinion. I think they take that as, they're giving me the answer the doctor said. And so, but I would agree with you. And that's the problem I have with these as well, is you like, okay, ask 10 doctors and see what 10 doctors say. And I'm guessing you get 9 different answers.
The WHO like saying health literacy is a big problem in the vaulted pages of the Lancet. I'm like, well, yeah, right. I mean, the New York Times is like, in some senses, about as good as it's going to get. It's better than Us magazine, I would think, and yet they also have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah,
right. And so, like, then we're talking about health literacy is a real problem, and we're thinking about misinformation, but are we not also the source of a lot of that misinformation because we just don't know and we don't confess it?
I think you're absolutely right. I think we are. I mean, if we knew all of these things with certainty, then you wouldn't see so many changes in the advice being given over time,
right?
Because we would know. We don't know. Sometimes we know, but not everything. There are lots of things where we don't know, and we should be transparent about that.
There's a totally separate issue, which is that there are frequently things where we actually do know, and then there's misinformation and disinformation to discredit that and drive people away. So I don't know. It's very complicated. It isn't getting any better.
No, it isn't.
The fact that there's more and more and more information is actually not helpful.
Yeah,
and I think we should stop making our syllabuses longer.
Oh, I'm in agreement with you on that one.
Is it the plural syllabus or syllabi?
Syllabi.
Is it
syllabi?
Is it Greek or
I think it's
Latin?
syllabi.
I can never remember.
I don't know.
think it's syllabi.
Syllabi. We're going syllabi. All right. We don't need to belabor that one. I think we're all sort of in agreement. So let's move on to our amazing and amusing. Jess, what do you got for us?
I have an interesting one here. This is a report from the journal, an article that was published in the journal Frontiers in Cell and Developmental Biology this past fall. And the title of the article that I read about it is called "Cooperative Sperm Outrun Loners in the Mating Race." Did you hear this one?
I like that.
So
cooperative sperm.
There was a group of researchers. They are in North Carolina, North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. What they were testing is the hypothesis that there's the idea and this is based largely in the research about infertility and rationales or understanding infertility, that the sperm that swims fastest is the one that gets there first. And what these investigators were researching and ultimately concluded, in a way I'll describe in a minute, was that sperm that stay clustered end up doing a better job moving in a straight line, which apparently seems to be the core necessity of being a successful sperm, is not to like bounce off the walls, but to kind of, get from point A to point B as effectively as you can. And being in a group allows them to maneuver through fluid, which is what they have to do, even though they go slower. So there are some sperm that are really moving fast and bouncing off the walls and not getting where they have to go. And then those that kind of, with the mindset, the collective or collaborative mindset, band together are more likely to have the quote unquote winner in that sort of context. And so it's an interesting, and so what this group of researchers did is they developed the anatomy and, to try to inject the sperm into a synthetic vagina and cervix.
Okay.
To try to test out their hypothesis that the cluster, the community, the cooperation actually achieved better results than the loners. And they seem to demonstrate this in ways I don't entirely understand, but
at the end of the day, one still has to
break free from the pack, right? And so one still has to break free from the pack. And so there is, it almost seems like marathon runners, right? That there's a benefit in the cluster, and that at the end,
then you sprint.
You have to sprint out. And the people who are, the runners who just immediately from the beginning are just like, whew, they can't make it all the way, or they're going to get lost because they're not, with the group. But it was an interesting parallel to kind of community see communities are being, kind of community or solo operations of organisms
in biology.
Slow and steady wins the race, maybe even for sperm.
Wow.
I have this vision of like the sperm peloton and wearing these little jogging.
That's what I was thinking too.
They obviously include some of these visuals, right?
Wow, that is actually so cool.
That is so cool. All right.
Mine is not as cool.
No.
Somebody had sent me, a friend of mine had sent me a WhatsApp link to some sciencey paper about spiders who'd been fed drugs and then couldn't make webs. So I clicked on this link thinking, that's perfect for the podcast. I'll do that. But it just took me to like a 1-paragraph thing with no like link to the actual paper. So then I went on the web and tried to find the actual source article. And the thing that it appeared to be referring to was a study actually done in 1995 by a group of space travel researchers, but I couldn't find the original paper either. But what I did find was a much older article that was published in Scientific American back in 1954. Mm-hmm. So it turns out that the field of spider web and psychedelic drugs goes way back.
Okay. All right.
And it was actually a very interesting article that concerns an orb spider called Zilla, Zilla, exnotata. Is its scientific name, and it's an orb weaver spider that lives in your garden, probably. And he goes through this very long description of how orb weaver spiders make their webs in the first place, which is really fascinating. And I won't go into it, but it's very sort of systematic. But the key step is that after they've created all these spokes in this very complicated way to sort of lay out the architecture of their web, they then spin the trapping web, which is a single thread.
So you're the circular one.
It's a circular one.
You're making a circular motion
with
your fingers.
It does a giant spiral from the outside in and goes all the way in and converges.
And it's a single thread.
And the final catching web is a single thread. And so to study this, they had to create a whole methodology for how do you do this. Like, first of all, how do you give drugs to a spider? Right? It's tricky.
You have a party.
The way they did it is that they dissolved cannabis and mescaline and caffeine in sugar water and fed it to fruit flies. And then they fed the fruit fly to the spider.
Interesting, yeah.
Right? And watched what would happen. And then they would destroy the web so that the spider would have to come out drug intoxicated and rebuild their web.
This is just kind of mean.
This sounds like they had been taking the substances when they designed the study.
One does wonder. What was going on with the researchers here. And then, of course, they also had to come up with a methodology for how to study the web design. And so they did it by using some chemical apparatus that would create a vapor through a chemical reaction under the web, and then which would deposit silver crystals all over the web, so that the cameras could picture the web, the web strands easily against a white backdrop. And so then they did it. And of course, the results were that when you give spiders drugs, lo and behold, their webs are not very good. But they're
we
not.
Really learned a lot
but
there.
They're not good in ways that are specific to the drug. So like mescaline intoxicated spiders will neglect whole sections of the orb and just not do them at all. And, spiders that have received benzodrine, which is a tranquilizer and an antihistamine, turns out that their spiral becomes all wobbly. And so they lose that sort of beautiful symmetry as they're making the arc to sort of spiral into the center. Instead, you get this sort of chaotic. It's like they're basically all over the place. They're drugged, they're intoxicated. And so the practical application of that answers your question about whether you should smoke pot and drive, or drink and drive, or take psilocybin or mescaline or benzodrine and drive.
To be clear,
and I think that if you're trying to drive in a spiral, then you should avoid benzodrine. If you're trying to get
you're just going around a cul-de-sac.
You should take mescaline. I don't know what the practical application of this is.
To be clear,
it probably is bad in all sorts of ways.
I'm sure it's all bad. I just want to clarify. Chris is referencing a conversation we had before the podcast started in which I just asked the question, which one of these substances made your driving even worse. I was not in any way suggesting
which is the worstest way to drive
anybody
home.
should be doing any of these things. I just want to get that out there into the record.
Even spiders, our spider listeners should not be taking drugs.
The question is, did they ask?
Right.
Did they evaluate what happened to the spiders when they tried to drive a little spider car? No, they
Isn't a
didn't.
spider
Or
car
their
an actual car?
depression, or what happened to their depressive symptoms too.
Yeah, that's a good point. That was the 50s. They didn't know yet.
They had euphoria, apparently.
Okay, I have a study that I'm sure you all heard about, but I could not resist us having a very brief conversation about it. So all I'm going to do is give you the title. I'm sure you will have heard of it anyway. And then I want you to give me your evaluation of the study based simply on the title, which is COVID Vaccine Hesitancy and Risk of a Traffic Crash. Good study. Good study. This is a real study published in the American Journal of Medicine, which is not it's not JAMA or anything, but it's not a fly-by-night thing either.
It's like their subtitle. It's not JAMA or anything.
Journal, right? What explains, and by the way, they found an association between vaccine hesitancy and car accidents. So what's the explanation?
So first of all, we have to predict the direction of the effect of the association.
No, it was harmful. The more
if
you're vaccine hesitant, the more likely you were to have car accidents. Do you believe it's causal, or is this what I'm getting at, Chris? Is this the car roof rack?
I think
scenario.
Probably yes.
For anyone who doesn't remember the car roof rack, that's Chris's analogy for confounding people who own car roof racks.
Don't get cancer and heart disease,
or get less cancer and heart disease because they are healthier. On average.
Healthier, right.
This one made the round. So you had not heard of this study?
I haven't heard of this either, but it reminds me of, in teaching quantitative methods here at SPH, I always use this example of like Nicolas Cage movies and drowning deaths.
Yep.
And those are statistically associated, like kind of that, that it was Nicolas Cage in a movie that year is associated with
increased
risk of drowning.
Which I think we can all say that is causal.
Clearly causal. It's always that illustrative example. So
anyway, I heard about this, and my immediate reaction was, oh, isn't that funny? But then I went and read it, and it's actually a fascinating case study for a class because...
Were they intending it to be a case study for the class, or were they taking themselves more seriously?
Well, I think they were taking themselves seriously. I think that they, if you actually read it, they use some language that would suggest they're getting at cause and effect. Rarely, but they do. There is some language in there that might suggest it. They never say cause and effect. But then if you read the rest of it, they actually are nowhere near cause and effect. And in fact, they go through in the limitations, we can't say this is causal. Okay, but we always say that in observational research, so how serious to take it? And so the question becomes, if you are doing a study like this with you're clear from the beginning, you can't get at cause and effect, why do it? And it gets at the distinction between causal, descriptive, and predictive research, right? So if you say, and if you read through this, their final conclusions are, maybe, and I'm not saying I buy the conclusions, but I'm just saying there maybe doctors want to talk to their vaccine hesitant patients about also being better drivers, right? So that would be a non-causal intrinsic. They're basically saying it's just a marker for, it's the car roof rack. It's just a marker for somebody who is more likely to take take more risks, things like that. And therefore, you might also want to say, if you have a person who's hesitant about vaccines, they may also be at increased risk for car accidents. And therefore, you may want to counsel them about driving, right? So there sort of is this aspect of it that you could actually say is right. Reasonable.
There's something there.
On the other hand...
But it's a little indirect.
On the other hand, I don't think that's the way most people are going to take it. And so then the question becomes, is it enough to interpret your data correctly if you know everybody else is going to interpret it differently? Yeah. So to me, it posed all these really interesting questions. So it was amusing, but then the more I thought about it, it's just a nice case study in trying to figure out what's our responsibility as researchers if we're doing a study in which we don't think it's causal, but we think it is a good indicator of something that could lead to good public health practice. So I thought it was a fascinating one.
That would be interesting, though, if someone who's vaccine hesitant, like it goes along with kind of, in a lot of ways, distrust of the medical community. And then if your doctor is telling you how to drive, that's probably the last thing that they would be like, now he's telling me I got to get the shot. Now he's telling me I got to fix my headlights and drive more slowly.
Stop taking psilocybin before I drive.
Yeah. Wow. Well, what would Tara Parker Pope say about this?
Good question. Good question. I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know. It's so tricky, and it gets back to the health literacy thing we were talking about earlier.
Yep.
Because, who wants to read an article where the authors are completely honest and they say, we have detected a likely spurious, biased, confounded, non-causal association.
Nobody wants to read that.
Between two factors that cannot be biologically related.
Nobody wants to publish that.
But the p-value is rather small.
Yeah.
And what are we going to do with that?
Yep. All right. Well, that is the end of our program. If you've got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a study or a topic for us to take on, you can no longer tweet us. I assume the @PopHealthyX Twitter handle is no longer active.
How are our plans for the podathon?
The podathon,
the 12 or 24 hour straight pod marathon.
When's that happening?
Podcast
Nick, have you scheduled that yet? There's going to need to be some. I don't know the answer to that.
Nick is like, yeah.
Well, anyway, so
where are my magic mushrooms?
The place you can find us is on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthex.org. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, Assistant Dean of Lifelong Learning at the BU School of Public Health. We want to thank Nick Guler for producing and supporting the podcast, and Mark Takachi for editing. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you'll download our next episode.